This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I am the author, the creator, and the proprietor of Respectonomics. And Respectonomics, as many of you may know already, has one purpose, one mission, one aspiration, and that is to restore the dignity of the human being. Now, in order to get this underway, we have our guest today, Sarah Benton. And Sarah comes from an investigative background, an HR background, and I'm absolutely confident that all her questions to me will be very easy and I'll have all the most comfortable answers. Yes?
It's quite possible.
Okay. Anyway, no, and I think everybody needs to know, hearing this message, that this is part of the weekly podcast, or is the weekly podcast. And the key behind this is we're trying to explore what Respectonomics can do, why it's so important, the reasons it's so important. And I think also you've mentioned, and other people have mentioned, who is Jeremy? And I think
exactly
that's one of the things you wanted to explore or talk about this morning.
I think probably the paramount thing today.
All right. Okay. Well, you mean I've got to talk about me?
Yes, you do.
Oh, how humbling. Okay. Well, over to you then, Sarah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And as all your listeners are aware, you've done, I think, 7 podcasts now in regards to introducing Respectonomics and had some great conversations and dialogues and covering topics. And so I think we thought that it would be great. I know on the initial podcast, you did a few little introductory items about yourself, but thought it would be great to get to know you a little bit better and share with your listeners a little bit of your background,
right,
that sort of had the imprint on Respectonomics and where you are today and what you're looking to achieve. So with all that said, I thought at this juncture it would be a great opportunity again, just to maybe go back to the beginning. So if you could tell us a little bit about maybe where you're from, where you grew up, just to start.
Can I talk about my birth?
Because you could probably go from, well, I don't know. Did it have?
It did happen.
It did happen.
Yes, it happened. And, it's
just happened.
I'm here now. No, it was interesting. I was actually born in Windsor Great Park. And the reason I know the story is because Jeremy, of course, had to come out a little earlier. And my father was driving a brand new car. And in those days, you may not remember this or know about this, but they used to talk about running a car in. And running a car in was brand new and you weren't meant to go over 45 miles an hour or whatever it was. Anyway, mother is screaming. Father is furious, saying, but my car's new. I can't possibly be driving this far. Anyway, they got me to the Ascot Nursing Home, which is where I was born. That was in 1950. So listeners need to know that I am 74, going on 75 next July. I will be sending out reminders of my birthday.
And invites, I'm sure.
Oh, yes. But anyway, no, obviously you can tell, therefore, I was born and raised in England. I went to school in England. I had nannies and we lived in London until I was about 10 years old. And then we moved to the country. And that's formative because that gave me the part that understood what you might call the urban part of living. But as importantly to me, and has stayed with me forever, is the concept of rural agricultural living.
Right.
The schooling was interesting. I went to prep school, which in those days was going to what we would have called public school. We call high school.
Yes.
And anyway, so I went to a prep school. And one of the things I remember distinctly about that is, and it sort of resonates today, when you were in your last term, it was almost mandatory, almost a convention, that whatever else, you would be a prefect. You would be a senior appointed officer of the schoolboys. And guess who never was?
You were not. And what does that officer entail? What are the duties?
I think it was actually a comment on maturity. And, and I'm actually now quite proud of my immaturity because, as George Bernard Shaw said, youth is wasted upon the young. And I think we see a lot of that
Very
today.
true.
Yeah, I
We
think it's
certainly
very
do.
applicable. And my father was one day berating to my grandfather, Jeremy's so immature. And he made a very interesting, grandfather made a fascinating response. He said, there's nothing wrong with being immature.
Hmm.
It's an interesting insight. And I think we all know immaturity when it's irresponsible isn't appropriate,
Right.
isn't fun.
Right.
But I think
Yeah.
the sense of having youthfulness and playfulness is very important. And I hope that comes through in Respectonomics.
I think so too. And I think it's lost in that,
Mm.
that sense of humor, or like you say, that youthfulness, the young at heart.
Yeah.
Things get too serious
Right. Yeah.
at times. So I think that's so that's good. So you were not an officer then.
No, they wouldn't let
And
me
now
go.
you're quite happy that you were not.
And I'm very happy because now look where I am. It does lead to the next point, which was then I was very, very, in one sense, very well educated.
Mhm.
I was at Eton, and where I got my A levels, as they call them, which is like your sort of grade 12 concentrated,
Right.
got my A levels in Latin and Greek in the classics. And that was my sort of background there. But the fascinating thing is, we've talked about my immaturity, but I would also tell you one other thing. Fascinates me, really. There were two subjects I failed at Eton. And
Okay.
failure in those days was that big F. It wasn't just a sort of negotiable subject. It was
Right.
letters to the parents and, you were ostracized.
And so what were those two subjects?
English and public speaking.
Isn't that
Yeah,
fascinating?
fascinating. So when I say I'm well educated, there's a part of me that says, excuse me, but you missed the boat. Because
Hmm.
education, I think this will come out in Respectonomics. Education is, the word comes from, well, here we go, from Latin, ex and duco, and it means
Right.
to lead out of. And one of the most important things about education is to lead somebody out of where they are themselves. And
Right.
Respectonomics is very big on that. It's very big on taking the human being and recognizing the incredible strengths and inner stories that people have to tell across the board.
How do you think that failing those two subjects impacted or influenced you?
Well, it's how I ended up at McGill University, which sounds like I'm being critical of McGill, but it was basically put to me that sort of very colonial, aristocratic, whatever you would call it. Oh, Jeremy, you're not going to make it here. So when you're
Okay.
told, when you're 17 years old and people tell you you're not going to make it, there's a bit of you that says, "Oh, well, I wonder where I can make it." And Canada's always had a fascination for me. This is real schoolboy stuff, but it had a fascination for me because I remember our geography lessons. And in geography in those days, they had those black and white strip films. I don't know what you'd call it.
Yes.
They were like projected on the screen and you
Hmm.
went one single picture to another.
Yes.
And when we were looking at Canada, there were two things that absolutely struck me. One was the incredible expanse, the pictures of the prairies. I remember them now, and I always will keep on in mind. Just that incredible expanse, which I think
Hmm.
as a country is something very, very important. We have that expanse, not only geographically, but also mentally, psychologically, culturally, socially. We are an
Yeah.
expansive
Yeah.
country, and I think we should be very aware of that. And the other thing, which still connects, is I couldn't believe it. In those days, if you went to Europe, to the continent, you had to have, you know, I don't know how many IDs and visas and passports. It was just, unbelievable. I mean, this is in the 1950s.
Right.
Anyway, point of the story was it was well advertised to us as schoolboys that Canada, to travel from one side to the other, you never needed a passport.
So that was the drive then that took you
Very,
to McGill versus
absolutely.
perhaps the United
Yeah.
States.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was just one of
Interesting.
those one of those things. But I think it applies very much today. Not only the expansiveness of Canada, but also
Right.
the fact that we are free to translate, to transport ourselves from
Hmm.
one side to the other, from the middle to the outer parts, wherever we want to go. That
Right.
kind of freedom is incredible and needs
And
to
it's
be enforced. Reinforced.
Right. And it's a unique country in the way, in terms of, as you're talking about it being expansive. I've had the good fortune of being able to live in different provinces.
Right.
And what I find really unique is it really is, although there's that underlying same theme, in different provinces, there's different ways of life, different philosophies on life and work too. So it's quite interesting. So it's
Yeah.
a fantastic place to be. So
Yeah.
that's neat. That was your decision that brought you to Canada, because that was
That's
going to
what
be one of
brought
my
me to
questions.
Canada.
How
Yeah.
did you end up here?
Then I arrogantly went up to the front door of McGill. This is a true story. Went up to the front door of McGill and said, I'd like to come here.
And
And
they said,
well, the admissions guy, I remember him, he looked at me and said, almost sort of like, this is not how it's done. Then he said, what are your credentials, or words to that effect? And I said, well, I've got my A levels in Latin and Greek. And he said, oh, he said, you'd be far ahead of everybody here.
Isn't that interesting?
Well, a light went on. You mean
Mm-hmm.
come to McGill and do nothing for 3 years? I'm in.
Now, you didn't do nothing for 3 years, I'm sure.
No, I didn't. Two things are very interesting, though. One thing's educationally interesting, and that is I was way ahead. I mean, don't forget, I'd done Latin and Greek since I was 7 years old.
Right.
So it was in my DNA at that point.
Mm-hmm.
The thing was, interestingly, by third, fourth year, you couldn't tell the difference. Everybody was.
Oh, okay.
And I just mentioned.
Everybody was at par.
Yeah. And I think that's important because there's a sense with a lot of us, I think, what we've missed out on, in whatever it is, educationally or socially. And in actual fact, it's all catchable, uppable. Because that's
All catchable, uppable.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
That's English for, let me explain. No, but everybody can catch up. And we should give each other that chance to catch up.
And do you think that has a lot to do with the environment that you're in and the people that you're around?
I don't think it was at the time. I think at the time I was actually, and it's interesting now looking back on it. You know how you can start talking about things that you might not have admitted at the time?
Yeah.
Certainly I did not enjoy Canada at the beginning. And there was a reason, very easy reason. I came from a background where everything was on my plate. I knew when I had cars, I had, social life, I had London clubs. I mean, I had everything. I mean, very spoiled. But the point of the matter is, it was a difficult start. And I'm grateful for that. And the loneliness that came with it, and the homesickness, which was no British schoolboy ever talks about homesick, ever.
Right.
Not allowed. But the point of the matter is, I'm glad I had that experience because I think a lot of people deal with those issues today. They deal with loneliness. They deal with homesickness in a way that they don't quite know how to identify it. They deal with different cultures that are being put upon them and they just don't know how to handle them.
Right.
I think we're all in that soup together. So that experience to me has been, it is beneficial.
Absolutely. And I think when we're put in those experiences, it allows us to sort of self-discover.
Yeah.
Right. And learn how to manage or to even flourish in those situations or environments.
I would say bingo.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened. And the other thing that happened was when I went for my job interviews, this is very difficult for younger people today. When I went with a degree in classics, 21 years old, it wasn't even that, I was 20 at the time, and you go into these corporate boardrooms. I think it's amazing to think that I actually had 3 legitimate major employment offers. And I'm only saying that not because I was doing anything clever. It was because that was actually the what would you call it, the paradigm of the time. You could get that kind of work. And I think today with people, they go in and file 10 resumes and they don't even get answered. That's pretty dispiriting. So my head start of being reassured that I was actually worthwhile was very important.
Right.
When I got the final job, the one I actually took, there's a story that goes with that that's very relevant to today, because I'm sitting there and it was almost a Hollywood scene, sitting at the board of directors table. And they had all the directors lined up on one side and Jeremy on the other. And, you could see them firing the questions and all that stuff. And the first question, I think it was actually the first question, they sort of looked at me because I had really nothing to offer. And they said, so what do you think you can do for us? And my answer was, well, actually, I'm not sure I really can, because I've only got a degree in classics, and I don't really know what a convertible debenture is even. But what I would like to do is to learn the business from the grassroots. What I didn't know was that was exactly what they were looking for.
I was just going to say, how was that received?
Very. And it turned out they were looking for two individuals. It was a very prestigious organization. They used to be the underwriters for Gulf Oil and Bell Canada and all kinds of things. It was a very small institutional company. I was actually hired by Mike Wilson, who became subsequently the Minister of Finance.
Ah, okay.
I mean, had that kind of, whatever you'd call it, kudos to it. But it turned out they were looking for two people. One person had to be very well qualified, technically. Well,
right.
That wasn't me. But the other one was somebody who wanted to learn from what you might call from the grassroots. And why that was of interest was because everyone else apparently who'd been going in, they had hundreds of applicants, but people were going in and saying why they wanted to be the president the next morning. Obviously,
it's funny you say that, because I find in the corporate world now, everything is instantaneous. Like we think about social media or responses or emails or text or everything is instant response. And I find there's a culture out there today, people entering into a company or corporation or a business, and they have expectations that within a very short window, they expect to go from point A to point Z instantaneously.
Yeah.
And I find that it's challenging because you're missing a lot of the growth in between.
Well, that's right. And my growth was exactly that, because day one, I literally had this metal box on wheels carting securities from 11 King Street to the Toronto Stock Exchange.
Yes.
I've done it. I know what it feels like.
Right.
And I'm glad I do.
Right.
As you rightly point out, it's part of the growth. It's part of the experience. It's that part of symmetry with other people's lives.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm very grateful for that start.
The other thing I found interesting that you said was, the changes, or how as a society or from a working environment perspective, how we've changed in terms of how we send out resumes, right? Or we're looking to get hired for a job.
Right.
This day and age, people are just filing out resumes. They're applying online. There's no people connect or interaction at that initial phase anyway. Whereas similar to you, when I first initially went and applied for jobs, I took my resume or my CV and I went in person to ask to speak with somebody first. So I had that initial human contact, that initial dialogue or conversation, and that sort of first impression. And I find that is missing typically from the manner in which how people apply for jobs these days.
I think, well, as you realize, that is absolutely true, what you've said. I think it's very dispiriting, horribly clinical, synthetic. I mean, the idea of looking at somebody's character on a piece of paper to me, is foreign. I mean, I would say to anybody, come and have a chat with me. Oh, and by the way, do you have a piece of paper?
Right. Because you're also relying on that person's ability to articulate their character onto a piece of paper. And not everybody, that's their forte. It's more the in-person so that you can really get a good sense. So I found that quite interesting.
Well, I think if you look at this conversation, we're not actually putting a piece of paper out there.
Right.
It's a development. It's a sort of almost like you're navigating and saying, well, what happened next? And you pull back, go forward, go sideways.
Yes, yeah.
Those issues are very important. And they, by the way, form the part of Respectonomics. It's Respectonomics. If we're going to restore the dignity of the human being, we have got to find ways, tools to bring people together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so many sort of topics, even within this conversation, that could lead to further discussion, right?
Right. Yeah.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask you as well is, you are the gentleman with the hyphen in your name. So I would love to, and I'm sure your listeners would also love to learn a little bit more about the history of your hyphenated name.
Well, if I go to my father, he's no longer with us, but if I went to my father, I would get the full colonial imperial history. And it goes something like there was a Wentworth who was, I believe, politically powerful. And I think it's the Earl of Stafford, Thomas Wentworth. And he was the guy who went and did nasty things in Ireland in the 1640s. And there was Stanley, who was the chap who actually was the one who was a kingmaker. And I think he was at the Battle of Bosworth and he gave Henry VII the nod. So there were sort of two families. So I was always brought up with that. Then there was the classic addition of my father saying, actually, we're from Edward III. Well, it turns out that if you go on Ancestry, whatever they call it, any of those things, you'll find that actually everybody goes back to Edward III. I mean, it's that whole idiot story. So the trouble with my background is I think there's quite a lot of what people wanted it to sound like. The way we, as children, the way we always came up with it was Wentworth had Wentworth had the money, the Stanleys had the class. We end up with neither. That used to infuriate everybody. But no, it's a very long-standing name. And it's rather interesting, and this is not a technical point, but a friend of mine who's very, I will say, musical, pointed out that Wentworth-Stanley is in fact lyrical as a name, that it has and he explained
the rhythm.
Yeah, but he explained to me why it works. But that's just a point of interest. But anyway, the other thing is, and I think I mentioned this to you once before, I have a middle name. And my middle name, I have Jeremy, that's my first name, and Wentworth-Stanley is, the last name. And by the way, as far as Respectonomics and podcasts is concerned, it's all Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. It's all JWS.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, there is another letter in the middle there, another W, another W, which stands for Wroughton, WROUGHTON, Wroughton. And when a North American says the word, it comes out. I might as well say it. Get it. Yeah, you've got it. You think it's very funny. It's not funny. It's hardly rotten. But anyway, the only thing I know, I've tried to find out recently why in the earth I am called Jeremy Wroughton, and my father was Charles Wroughton, and I never could figure out. Nobody ever told me how it came into being. And the only other bizarre connection is that 007, you remember who I mean, Mr. James Bond himself?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I like my martinis shaken and all that stuff. Anyway, Daniel Craig. His middle name is Wroughton.
Very nice.
Which I think makes me 007. I think that's the truth.
It must.
It must.
Or in disguise.
Yeah.
Or in disguise.
So smooth.
I love it.
But anyway, that's how that all came into being. And I've always, I've kept the name Wentworth-Stanley, and a lot of people my brother, for example, who is an artist, and you were asking about introduction to Jeremy. My brother, he shortened his name up to Richard Wentworth years and years ago. He's an artist. And he ended up being, by the way, the head of sculpture at the Royal College of Art.
Oh, wow. Wonderful.
And was awarded the CBE, which is a sort of one of the New Year's honors from the Queen, and was awarded the CBE for the work he has done with young people.
That's fantastic.
So I think
why did he change his name?
Look, very interesting, because at the time, go back to the 50s and all the 60s particularly, a hyphenated last name or doubled barrel last name wasn't a good idea.
Right.
It smacked of elitism and snobism and everything elseism. So that's why he did it. Interestingly, today he says he would have actually kept it. I mean, if
we knew now what we would have known.
Exactly. But his brand is Richard Wentworth, so it works for him.
Right. Yeah. So it works for him. That's great. So one of the other questions, so we know that you have or many listeners may be intrigued by the office in the barn. But what many listeners may not know is your passion as a gentleman farmer. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about your passion as a gentleman farmer, where that came into play. We touched on it. It almost came out a little bit at the beginning in terms of when you moved from London out onto the outskirts, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, It's interesting because I do have an absolute love for, and I'm not farming in the literal sense of being the one who's out there cultivating and harrowing.
Right.
I enjoy doing that, but I just love countryside. I love the
Mm.
space, and I live on as you know, you've been here. I live
Yes.
on a farm, and I live
Yeah.
on 200 acres, and the house is in the middle of the property. And that may sound just whatever it sounds like. But you know something? That also is one of those ways where you have freedom of thought, freedom of expression. You don't feel
Mm.
constrained.
So
So,
you're at the epicenter, the
yeah,
heart of
yes,
the, yeah.
yeah. And it is. And one of the things I have found is, and I hope listeners are hearing this one, because I sit on the tractor cutting grass. And a lot of people would look at me and say, really? Because I cut 80 acres of grass because it looks nice. And the other things that I do with chainsaws and who knows what else, loaders and whatever. But the point of the matter is that is actually my alter ego.
Mm.
And it was said to me many a moon ago, always make sure that your hobby never becomes your career.
Mm.
So that is
And
my hobby. It's
did
a
you learn
one.
that from a particular mentor or leader, or is that
Yeah, I
just something
did.
you
Yeah,
heard?
from Uncle Guy. Uncle
Uncle
Guy,
Guy.
Uncle Guy. Everybody has an Uncle Guy. And he ended up being the executive vice president of Massey Ferguson. And his
Okay.
claim to fame was he was the one who engineered Massey Harris merging with Ferguson.
Ah,
That was his
okay.
actual real claim to fame. And Uncle Guy, he told me a story, not a story. He gave me one piece of advice which has stayed with me and I think is profoundly, profoundly true. I was in his living room one day up in Forest Hill in Toronto,
Hmm.
and typical 21-year-old or whatever was bleating about something or other. And he looked at me with those great big bushy eyebrows and that frown and, that whole Victorian look. And he said, my boy, as he used to call me, my boy, when you're in Rome, you will do as the Romans.
Mm.
And that has been very, very much I believe, and my faith today.
Hmm.
I think it's very important. Yes, I'm allowed to have my identity. I'm allowed to be the gentleman farmer. I'm allowed to have some British habits. I'm not sure what they are any longer, but I can be who I want to be.
Right.
Canada's wonderful for that. But I
Yes.
think the greater principle is, yes, I'm in Rome and I will do as the Romans. I'm in Canada and I will do as the Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a philosophy that would stand the test very, very well in today's world of immigration.
Right. Do you find so your passion or your hobby, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
do you find being around that much vastness of space in the farmland, do you find that grounds you? Do you find that grounds you in what
That's
you do outside
raises a
externally of that?
fascinating point because I think it's not so much the expansiveness, which is lovely. I mean, that I consider just to be spoilt, privileged, and everything else. It's lovely. The dogs, the horses, all that
Hmm.
stuff. That's wonderful. And I appreciate it. I think when you use that word rooted or
Hmm.
grounded, I think
Grounded. Yeah.
grounded. And I think that's a word that needs to come back into our vocabulary. And the
Hmm.
reason is one of the people you've met him, James,
Yes.
one of the things he is an old time farmer and he understands the soil. He understands the nature of nature. He understands the importance of, looking after the ground and so on. He
Hmm.
knows where his tomatoes come from. He knows where his meat comes from. In today's world, most people haven't got a clue where anything comes from.
Right.
And in that same sentence, people are not well grounded. And it sounds
Hmm.
almost trite, but I wish everybody would have a tomato plant in their front living room,
Hmm.
see the wonders of nature, to see how that little seed can turn into something quite extraordinary.
Right. Well, if you think about grounding and farming and if you think about it from this perspective, if you have the right nutrients,
Mm-hmm,
the right climate,
mm-hmm, yeah,
water, sun, food, you're going to grow something
yeah,
fabulous. If
yeah,
you're missing any of those parts,
right.
you're going to have difficulty. So if you think about it as being grounded, what are those foundations? Again, that's a whole other topic for another
Well, it
podcast
is,
for
but
you.
it's extremely well connects to the nature, the physicality of the human being. Without the right
Absolutely.
nutrients, we do not do very well, whether it's in body,
Right.
mind, or soul. We don't do
That's right.
well.
You don't feed those things properly,
Feed them
right?
properly.
Care
And
for
that's
them
what
properly.
respectonomics, I mean, one of the things is, one of the problems with respectonomics is it says rather grandly, we're in the business of restoring the dignity of the human being. And everybody goes, yes.
Mhm.
But you know something?
Right.
What we have to do with that is to give people the tools. We have to give
Yeah.
them equipment. We have to give them a knowledge of what they can do with it. It's not
And
fair
not
just
only that, and an understanding and an awareness of what's lacking or what that actually means,
right. Yeah.
right?
Well, I think awareness is a brilliant word. I mean, look at
Hmm.
when we talk about being grounded as a farmer and so on, you are aware of whether we got a lot of snow, whether we got enough water, whether we got enough heat. What do they call it? I can't remember the proper word for it, but getting the heat elements that you need, all of these
Yes.
kinds of things is an issue of awareness. I think one of the problems that a human being has today is that we have been roboticized. I don't know if there's such a word, but we've
There's a
been
few words that I'm learning on this.
okay. Well, I'm making them up as I go along.
I like them. You could create a whole new dictionary.
All right.
I love it.
But no, I mean, I think the problem is that in losing awareness, the way we've just talked about it,
Right.
as you lose awareness of the outside part of it, you also lose awareness of the inside part of it. The two
Hmm.
go hand in hand. I think
Absolutely.
I think that awareness, self-awareness is very valuable. And I hope
I think
Respectonomics is not only raising the flag on this, but it's got to give people the ability to raise the flag. It's not
if
fair just to make big statements.
yes, and if you don't have that self-awareness, how are you going to recognize what it is that you need in order to,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So look, it's kind of neat. The analogies between the farming,
Right.
the passion for the gentleman
Yeah.
farmer over to respectonomics.
It,
So along those lines,
mhm.
I guess, what inspired you to create respectonomics?
um, I don't know if I can use the word inspired. And
Okay.
let me give you a little background. What we haven't talked about is my business career as such, which was
Hmm.
and my pension statement says 51 years. It's
Yes.
the
And you
IDC.
touched on it briefly in your intro podcast.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But I mean, 51 years is way too long. Nobody should do that. But one thing I want to say about that, though, was at the end, I didn't know this. I really didn't. But I was exhausted.
Mm.
In other words, I think I had played all my inner cards. I don't think
Mhm.
didn't know it. And one of the
Right.
things is goes under the heading of awareness, and it goes under the heading of sometimes just taking a break is when you recognize that actually your cards have been played or
Mhm.
not. Maybe you got some
Right.
left to play, fine. But just taking time out. People aren't very good at taking time out these days.
No, because it's driven into us.
Yeah.
How hard did you work? How much
Yeah.
time did you put in? We're actually driven the complete opposite direction,
Right.
right?
I mean, people come back from vacation and the time honored question is, what did you do? Well,
Hmm.
the answer is, did you have a restful time?
Right.
That's a better question. But
Right.
but anyway, no. So 51 years in the trenches of investment banking, which took me from research through to trading, through to Eurobond syndication. What else did I do? Well, a lot of corporate work anyway, and then
Right.
and then ended up in wealth management. And
Right.
in a way, I mean, that sounds like one of those rather glossy, what I did with my careers. You could almost hear you're saying that was my career, and almost you want to say in brackets, aren't I clever? And that's a
Hmm.
terrible mistake. No, stuff happened. It was delivered to me. Opportunities arose. Opportunities died, but that's what happened. So I did my 51 years. When I retired, and there is a bizarre story to go with it, which I won't go into now, but basically, my wife, Kathy, said, why don't you stop messing around and write a book? And I'd been on the radio that morning. That's what
Right.
prompted the question. So I started writing the book. And as a matter of fact, and I think this is an important point, actually, I retired that afternoon after Kathy's comment.
Yes.
Sounds incredibly sudden. But you know something? When the light goes on,
Mm-hmm.
key is in the lock.
When you know, you know.
When you know, you know. And nobody should ever fight anybody on that.
Right. Right.
Just to be able to have that knowledge that your key has now been taken out of the lock and you're free to go somewhere else.
Right.
It's lovely. So anyway, started writing the book. And you have an HR background and other things, and maybe you can explain it, but I can't. I started writing the book, and about 3 months, it was quite a funny book, actually. It was called A&D, small A&D, and then it was called the conjunctions of life. Because life is, in fact, a series of conjunctions. I mean, there's no
Right.
such thing as a straight line. I mean, how
Right.
do you explain having a cup of coffee and then getting in the car? I mean, they're
Right.
totally dissonant, except they both happened. They conjunct
Right.
one another. So anyway, point is, as I started writing the book started writing me. I
Mm.
started having these extraordinary thoughts, revelations, insights, and I really sat at my desk, the desk where you're seeing me now, and I heard myself saying to myself, where on the earth is this coming from?
Mm.
And the book went on the back burner, which I'm actually glad it did, because had I done the book, it would have been sold to my 25 best friends. And that's
Right.
the end of that, I think.
Right.
So, but anyway, out of this evolved Respectonomics, as I began to see that the human being is being marginalized and ostracized in so many ways. And, you can blame culture, you can blame politicians, you can blame, and so on. But that inner being of the human being has been basically set aside. It's been
And
hijacked.
could you say that came from then an awareness yourself?
I think so, yeah. Because when I look through my experience at CIBC Wood Gundy, for example, I became very aware of the number of times you weren't listened to, you weren't appreciated. And I mean, when you read today of people who are retiring or leaving their jobs, quite often all you hear in the subtext when you actually strip away the onion skin, what you actually hear is nobody liked me, nobody appreciated me.
Mm.
And
Nobody
appreciation.
heard me. Nobody heard
Well,
me.
listening is very difficult. I understand
Mm-hmm.
that, and it's an exercise in itself.
Right.
The truth is, though, that yes, I had plenty. I talked a bit earlier about the life of a schoolboy and how you were homesick and upset and all these kinds of words. Actually, I think we have a lot of those same experiences in our careers.
Absolutely.
Can you imagine going into the boardroom and saying, "I feel hurt"? The first thing that
Right.
would happen is they would buy a box of Band-Aids and send you out. That was the end of that. And then they would probably charge your expense account.
And not only that, I don't think people would ever feel comfortable going in and say, I feel hurt.
No, but
You
it is,
immense,
but I mean,
right?
these are huge human dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that I don't want to use the word passionate about it, because I think, you've heard that expression, I'm passionate about something, and
Right.
it's usually code for, I want my way, highway, and all that stuff. My concern is that people have tremendous amounts to offer.
Right.
Give you an example. I was in our daughter's horse barn, and there's a lady there who's mucking out the stalls. She's there every Saturday morning. And as you can imagine, mucking out the stalls is a pretty dead end job.
Mucky business.
Mucky. And there you are with the fork and messing around and all this stuff with wheelbarrows and whatever. It's incredibly mechanical, and no amount of new technology can ever change it. It is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, there she is. And I'm in there bringing her a cup of coffee and a lemon tart cake, I think it was.
Very nice.
Get at the local bakery. And we're falling into chatting. And I loved to let the chat go anywhere and everywhere. And it was fascinating. She suddenly blurted out, empaths have no boundaries.
Oh, I agree with that.
So do I. But look where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
And I practically dropped everything I had in my hand and said, Stephanie, where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I just thought of it. And I
Hmm.
mean, what I'm getting at is, excuse me, what I'm getting at is I think a lot of people have brilliant thoughts, brilliant insights, but they need a sort of, not an audience exactly, but a stage whereby they feel comfortable to be able to say things.
I was just going to say you were a safe space and she
Mm-hmm.
felt comfortable in that moment in unloading that, if you will,
Right.
right? Or sharing that.
Yeah. And Respectonomics is very big on safe space.
Mm-hmm.
To give it I mean, just to frame it properly, not only is it to restore the dignity, we've talked about that, but people will then say to me, well, what's the business of Respectonomics? And the
Mm-hmm.
business is to honor other people's freedom of choice.
Right. And interesting, because I was going to that leads very nicely into kind of the next question that I have is, how does Respectonomics aim to make a difference in people's lives, whether that be personally, because sometimes personally also impacts professionally.
Right.
But what's the aim to make the difference?
I'm going to pick up on that first point, the personal and the professional. I do not
Mm-hmm.
see any distinction between those two.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as you know, Stephen Covey, who wrote the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People,
Yes.
one of his great creeds or his central points is that what you are under one condition, you are in another.
Mm-hmm.
The rather crude, unpleasant example he gave was if you're cheating on your wife, you're likely cheating on your wife, your spouse. If you're cheating on your spouse, you're likely cheating on your customer. It's crosses all boundaries. So his point,
Underlying, yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
So therefore, when you talk about raising somebody's sense of self-worth, it becomes expressed not only in their personal life, which is what you were talking about, but also in their professional life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a wonderful, wonderful
Right.
combination. And I think what
Mm-hmm.
we need to do, what Respectonomics does, I mean, we're now into the what you might call the nitty gritty. You can almost hear yourself saying, jolly good idea. What are you actually going to do about it? And I've got two answers to it.
Right.
One is in general talking around. And I mean general, in other words, I make a point of talking about it with as many people that I come into contact with. And one of the things I have found
Right.
is this huge, almost like a appetite, an acceptance, a desire to be included. People want
Mm-hmm.
their identity back. They want to know that they're worth it. And they frankly do not feel they are. One example I
Right.
can give was a local store that I went into. I happen to know this store is extremely well run. They get on extremely well individually. Their service is impeccable. And there's just a lot of very fine things about this store. And Shannon, behind the counter one day, said to me, and she's a family friend, said to me, what is it? What exactly are you doing? And I gave her the sort of, 3 seconds. She stopped what she was doing, came around from where she was, came around to my side to give me a big hug. I think
Oh,
that demonstrates where people are in wanting their dignity back. The restoration word is not just it sounds a bit like a sort of, well, we'll restore this piece of equipment or something. There's a part of
right.
that. But restore also means returning what has been taken away from you.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, when you say, something was stolen, but it was restored, we have been stolen. We have lost our dignity. We've lost our self-worth. We've lost our individuality.
Mm-hmm.
So I think
Do you
that,
think it's been, sorry,
no, go on.
I was going to say, do you think it's been taken? And do you think at some point too, though, we've also given it away?
Oh, both.
Yes. We don't
Absolutely.
have the
It's
tools
being
and
taken
resources
away.
to know.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the reasons we've given it away is because, and this is getting a little heavy, but culturally speaking, one of the things that's happened is government has become bigger and bigger in our lives. And you can see that by the way they spend the money. And whatever your fiscal sense of that is, the other sense is this. When you are being looked after by the government, there's a point at which you throw your hands up. Don't you know? You don't even throw your hands up. You put your hands in your pocket and you say,
Right.
they'll look after me. It doesn't take long before you get into that sense of complacency and thoughtlessness. And it's not a happy place.
Robotic.
Robotic is a word I use.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But in order to get this out there are 2 or 3 things. We're doing this podcast now. This is part of the message. We're absolutely insisting, demanding that people get back to us and say what they want to see, what they want done. In other words, this is no man is an island. We need inputs from everybody.
It's collaborative.
It is collaborative in every sense. We need to have you, me, us being on the stage, doing public speaking. We need workshops. We need to have consultations. I've been doing quite a few of them, but they need to be done more. Now, here's the really almost the pincer movement. And that is, we've been asked, who's your market? Because anybody who's selling hamburgers or automobiles knows you have to define your market. Pretty traditional stuff. Interestingly, Respectonomics is across the board.
Right.
I think it's called a panoply. It absolutely crosses every boundary. Unfortunately, taking an everything approach doesn't necessarily get results. What does get results is everyone believes in the formula of getting this dignity back. But it's the managers, the supervisors, the executives, and the directors, whether they are in the corporate corridor, whether they're in the political corridor, they need to be the ones that initiate these changes. I want to see a time when the chair of the board comes up to you personally and says, thank you. Thank you for even showing up at work. Might be as basic as that. But start getting themselves back to where they are meant to be. You know, a lot of these leaders have forgotten the one underpinning to leadership, and that is leadership is defined by servanthood. It's not a question of me being coercive and saying, you ought to be doing this. It's a question of me saying, what can I do to help you?
Right. It's about culture. And that trickles down from the top down.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think it is a top-down thing.
It'll infiltrate, right?
I believe that. I do believe that. And I think the market needs to be, and if a CEO is listening to this today, a chief executive officer, chief financial officer, pay attention. Because people need to be respected. And it's not a question of putting out, those awful emails you get. We want to wish you a wonderful season and a holiday, blah, 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 and the time with your families. And thank you for all your contributions in the last 6 months, 12 months, or whatever it is. And you can almost hear the person signing off. Actually, he's not even, or she's not even signing off. It's his assistant.
Right.
I mean, it's awful. It's dishonest. But coming out and doing a straightforward thank you, a straightforward exhibition of grace, an exhibition of we need to be in the business here to help you. I once heard it in the sales.
Human connect.
Absolutely. And, some people might say to me, this sounds very moral and jolly good. Let me put 2 warning shots across the bow. Anybody who's got a sense of the canary in the mine knows that the world today is in a terrible mess. You don't have to sniff very hard. You know it's in trouble. The foundations are very weak. The immune system, if you like, is very weak.
It's compromised.
It is compromised. It's a very good word. And the risk we run into, here's number one. Risk number one is that as these things fall apart, you remember Ernest Hemingway used to say, when you go bankrupt, it happens very slowly, and then you go over the cliff.
Right.
And that is the truth about society today. We're in this creepy crawly going towards the edge, and when we go over the edge, there will be nothing to pull it back. We need each other. That's not a moral statement. It's a statement of survival. It's a statement of, I suppose, society. It's actually a statement of your family. We need to be the ones that are actually going to say, no, we need to pull back. Number one. Number two, if you look at let's just say the workforce today, or the employment base, whatever you want to call it, and we've used the word a little too often. We've said how roboticized people have become. Or to put it into proper English, people have become robots. And there's a very important point to that. This is a chicken and egg point. Because if we have become robots, we may have a body. That's the body that does the job. We have a mind that processes whatever we're told to do. But if we've lost our soul, I know one other hyena that's lost its soul, and that's AI. AI doesn't have a soul. It admits it freely. It can't.
Right.
Turn off the electricity, it dies. There's nothing there. So AI is exceedingly mortal and exceedingly soulless. And soulless is very, very good at taking over soulless. So if you look at the workforce today, the people who are working, I'll put to you, in fact, this is not a Jeremy original, but it's been said that between AI and quantum computing, which are the sort of first cousins,
yes,
we could be looking at 40% unemployment. Because you think of all of the work that could be done, let's say technologically, use one word. Well, I think the human being needs the other human being. And the way to connect one with the other is to give them back their self-worth. And I think the currency that we should use is dignity.
Absolutely.
I rest my case.
I was going to say on that topic, one last question for you before we wrap up. Because I'm sure, what we've had our dialogue today, there's many branches that we can veer off from. But if you could go back and give yourself, your younger self, some advice, what would that advice be?
I think the thing where I really feel I lost my way was not being assertive. I didn't have that self-confidence, or if I had the self-confidence, didn't know how to express it. I could be very, very clumsy in the way that I approached people or situations. And the years have sort of rounded out some of that stuff. But, I wish I'd had, and I see it, you're a good example. You will actually say, this is how I feel. You're very clear on that. Part of my, I suspect, British upbringing was you didn't show those feelings. And I think that's a terrible mistake. I wish I had been, as I say, if the word is assertive, but being clearer and defining of who I am and where I wanted to be. And I would say that to a young person today. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I've really appreciated the additional insights into Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley and appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Sarah.